ISO FileMaker Magazine, the professional's resource for FileMaker know-how.
Well, hello there, my fellow FileMaker learners and developers. This is Matt Petrowski bringing you these FileMaker tutorial videos from my website, FileMakerMagazine.com. In this video, I'm happy to bring you the topic of assessing performance within your FileMaker solution. This is just one little aspect of how you can determine whether or not your solution is going to keep up or whether you can make it a little bit faster than maybe it already is. Let's take a look at the file and head to my desktop. Alright, so here we are on my desktop with the two files that I have as a showcase. And the first thing I want to give you is a caveat. This FileMaker file was created as a file to be used locally on a desktop machine. It was not necessarily designed to be hosted, but yet it still provides a great example of how to assess your performance when you're dealing with something, say, as simple as the layout. Now, performance with regards to schema, there's so many different aspects of performance when it comes to FileMaker, but this is just something that gives you a tool to use when you're looking at processing how FileMaker does things. That's what I'm trying to show you in this video. How do we think about what is the cost of what I'm implementing? So given that the performance hit wasn't really that big of a deal on this file because it was going to be a local file on the desktop. But let's pretend that it's actually going to be hosted and go through this process. So I have two files here. I have file A, and then I also have a modified file, file B, something that I have changed so that it would be more performant. I love the fact that that word didn't exist, but now we can use it because it sounds like it fits. So let's go through file A and take a look at what I saw as a potential issue. We go into layout mode on this particular file, and the first thing that I noticed when I was in this file is that we have a lot of icons representing things that are going on. Now, the first thing that you need to know is where and how do you see these icons if they're not turned on in your copy of FileMaker. Everything that we're interested in with regards to layout mode is going to be found under the View menu, under the Show submenu. And here we're going to be able to highlight or turn on all kinds of different things in terms of what we see in layout mode. That's going to be buttons, sample data. I love this one actually when I design. We'll see in the other file that I am localizing the file so that it supports multiple languages, and this one becomes more or less essential. Text boundaries, field boundaries, sliding, non-printing, popover, hide condition. So really the things that we are interested in when it comes to our layout is where and how many times are calculations going to be evaluated. For the most part, a FileMaker file is just this giant ball of calculations, and those calculations having to be evaluated, either they happen at certain times, and we want them to happen as infrequently as possible in relation to giving the user the display of the most accurate data. So if we don't have to have calculations firing off, then we don't want them to. So placeholder text, that is a calculation. Hide conditions, that is a calculation. Conditional formatting is potentially multiple calculations. Script triggers, not really a calculation, but something that happens as a result of when the user interacts with the user interface. Quick find, not really a calculation. Tooltips, calculation. So you can see that I have all of these turned on, and when I go into a layout, I'm looking for what is it that FileMaker is going to be doing. Now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take a trip over to the Objects Inspector. Yours may be set to the fields initially, but let's take a look at the objects. As I collapse this slide control up, we can see that initially on this layout, there's really only 3 objects. In fact, when we're selected here, we can do a Command or a Control A and select everything, and then use on the Macintosh, the Option arrow, or the Option key with the arrow key, either one way or the other, and we can simply collapse all things or expand all things. And it's pretty nice. It'll expand the whole tree out, using that Option right arrow versus the Option left arrow to collapse all things down. It gives us a really good impression of how many things do we have on this layout, and then using those displays of what we're showing, such as all the different calculations going on, we can sort of get an idea of what's happening on the layout. So not a super complex layout. I'm sure that you're working with files that have a lot more layouts. This is just an example of a simple login dialog, which in a FileMaker solution you would have already logged in. But again, this was a local hosted file. So when I look at this, I see that I've got all of these little eye icons, and I'm thinking to myself, why are all of these here? And are all of them a lot of the same thing, or are they different? So let's take a look at what's going on. We'll put this to the side. I have gone to the fourth area, to the Data tab. That's where we're going to see the behavior of the hide object when. So first off, what's really nice is we should know that we can use this little eye icon in the sidebar here of the Objects panel in order to hide certain things. I can see that when I make my initial selection, as opposed to this one, and my selection jumps as I make selections. When I make this initial selection, it is obscuring all of the objects behind it. So we'll go ahead and hide that one. First off, I will take a look at the calculation. I can see that it says not is logged in. Now I happen to know that is logged in is not a function that FileMaker has natively, meaning this very clearly is a custom function. So we'll go take a look at that and see what it's doing. I'm going to hide this object so that I can look at the other objects underneath. So I'll select this one, is logged in. Well, that's familiar. I've seen that one before. I select the field, is logged in. I select the password. There's a little bit different right here and a little bit different right here. Oh, here's is logged in again. Here's not is logged in. So we're getting a inverse of the same custom function. So at this point, and these are probably also is logged in and is logged in. So the first thing that I think to myself is, this is a lot of different calculations that are all being fired. They're calling a custom function, and they're simply being used on a lot of different objects. Wouldn't it be wiser if I simply selected all of these or grouped all of them and then put that hide condition on that whole group? Yeah, I could do that, but here's why I don't like doing that. I don't personally like grouped objects because then I have to know that I have to select them explicitly in the object palette when they are a group, because otherwise the initial selection is the group, and then you can click a second time within the group and FileMaker will select the object underneath, but I consider that a bit of a hassle. So for the most part, I like to leave my objects ungrouped. The next thought process would be, can't I put all of these objects in a container and use that to hide? Now we can see right here that when I make this selection, we can see very clearly that this particular, all of these objects that are using the same custom function to determine whether or not they should show are all contained within a panel. Now a panel is a container object along with tab panels, portals contain fields and other objects. You can use a container object and put a hide condition on that. Now, when we select on this, we can see that it is, in fact, because of this icon, using its own hide condition. Right there, it's saying not is empty, loading. So this is not is logged in. This is something that is completely different. So this already was being used in order to show the condition, or to show a different, use a different condition in order to determine whether it should hide or not. So it couldn't be used by taking it off of all of these individual objects and then just putting it on the one containing object. So at this point, I decided to go look at that mysterious is logged in custom function. So we bring up the custom functions for this particular file, and we go to the is logged in right here. We open that up, and we see something that can be a little bit disconcerting. And that is the fact that I am seeing SQL right off the bat. Select from. So this custom function of is logged in, which is being used on multiple different objects, is using a custom function that is calling FileMaker's execute SQL. Now, if you don't already know, execute SQL can be wonderfully advantageous when you want to go grab something from a table occurrence or from something from a separate context than where you are currently in on your FileMaker solution. Context being when you are on a layout, that layout is tied to a table occurrence. That table occurrence can see all other table occurrences that are connected to it. But if you want to grab something from a disconnected group of table occurrences, then execute SQL can be wonderful for that because you don't need to add yet another table occurrence to your existing collection and establish a new context for that particular layout. But the problem is execute SQL, depending on the type of selection that you're doing, can be very costly. And what happens is all of these things add up. So here comes the performance tip to you. How can you determine what is happening? Because what would be really nice is in a lot of programming languages or in a lot of environments, what you can do is you can cache the results of a query that you've gone out and made. So for example, a FileMaker engineer that's programming FileMaker would be able to say, how many times have I seen this exact SQL selection statement within a period of time? And they can do it within fractions of a second, within milliseconds. They could say, within the last 500 milliseconds, which I believe is half a second, have I seen this exact same selection? And if that's the case, they could have cached the result of this particular selection statement and said, well, I don't need to really run this again. And I would have been able to be, it's optimized. So let's take a look at that in a visual format and see what happens. So FileMaker, the user lands on this layout that we have right here on screen. This FileMaker works in order of all of its objects from the bottom down, which is actually from the top. So this is the first object that FileMaker sees, then the second, and then so forth. We can always determine this by selecting off, making sure that we have nothing selected on the layout, and then initially hitting the tab key. You can see that I just hit the tab key, and the first object that was selected was the bottommost object, or the first object. When I hit the tab key again, you'll see that it moves to the next object. So the tab key, when in layout mode, is simply cycling through all of the objects. Now, where did it go right now? Well, it went to the panel, and then it's going to go to the first objects within that panel and climb up the chain. So you can see as I tab the tab key, it's cycling through. So we know that the first object that it's going to hit that has the condition of is logged in is probably this box right here. We go look, we can see there it is logged in. So in a conventional world with a programming system, the FileMaker engineers would take the time and say, I am not going to run multiple select statements if within the first half second I can determine that that has already been done. Again, what I'm stating right now is what probably happens in other programming environments, but we don't know for sure that that's what happens within FileMaker. But it would be a good way in order to optimize performance, meaning I have to make sure that this isn't going to hit multiple times. And if I found it on this particular object, the next object that I get to, this one, I really don't need to run it. I'm just going to actually use the same result that I got. That would be an optimized way of approaching this. But I am suspect that FileMaker is actually running this each and every time, which means that SQL statement, if it was complex, would not be performant at all. It would be hitting multiple times. So, how do we see how many times FileMaker is doing something? That's where we're able to assess performance, and that's what we're going to talk about next. All right, so let's talk about how can we see what is happening in this file when we hit or land on this layout. I'm going to go into layout mode so that FileMaker is not going to, it's not running the calculation of any of these hide calculations currently. I'm going to bring up my data viewer. And in the data viewer, we are going to be able to see how many times this particular SQL function is being executed. We want to see how many hits we get. Hits is just a very generic term that you can use in order to determine how many things something is done. Now, in previous videos, which you can search the magazine website, I've talked about benchmarking. Benchmarking is when you have a script, and at that script at the very top, you put a start time, and at the very bottom, you put the ending time minus the stop time in order to get your duration. You use this type of tool in order to benchmark and compare the operation of one variation of a script versus another, and it allows you to determine which one is going to be faster. We're always wanting to get the fastest or best performance out of our solutions. In this scenario, I happen to know that the isLoggedIn custom function is being called multiple times by multiple hide calculations on the objects on the layout. So we'll go to the function directly is logged in. And the good thing about this function is it's already within a let format. Now, the great thing about let is let allows you to define all three variations of variables. We have a locally scoped variable, meaning this is only seen by this let function. Then we have a local variable, which would be just a single $sign equal to something. And that would be local to a script. It originated in scripting, but it can be used pretty much anywhere. And at least in let statements, we can use it there as well. And the great thing about local variables is they can and will be rendered and used on the layout until the layout is modified. But the one that we're most interested in is a global variable. And you know, if you've watched any of my videos, anything that is global in nature, I like to capitalize. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to say that hits is going to be equal to, and what I want to do is when I go into browse mode on this layout, I want to see how many times this one function gets hit, knowing that this is being called, the execute SQL is being called each time. And I want to see, and this is something that you can do when you consolidate things down to a single point of reference in terms of the code, such as a custom function, which is done right here. We afford ourselves the opportunity to do that. So we're going to use the list function, and what we're going to do is we're going to combine anything that was already added to the hits plus what we initially get. Now in FileMaker there is a really good function, so I'm basically going to combine whatever gets added initially to this, continually add to this a value. Now when we're benchmarking, if we want to track things, there's really only one thing that we can use that will give us a good representation of what is happening, and that's within our milliseconds. And we are going to use, in that particular case, that is going to be UTC milliseconds. Let's see, right there. So this one function, with regards to any type of testing or benchmarking or anything, this is the smallest unit of time that we have within FileMaker. So I'm going to combine that with all of my hits and then just put that in. So what I've done is I've added something similar to benchmarking, but it's actually not benchmarking. It's just a way to track how many times is this thing being called. So when I say OK to my custom function, I know that my layout, as I move my data viewer off to the side here, my layout is currently in layout mode. So as soon as I go into browse mode, what's going to happen is every one of these hide calculations is going to be evaluated. And every one of these that are calling a custom function, within that custom function, that variable is being set, or the UTC milliseconds is being captured. Now it's possible that FileMaker, depending on the speed of the machine, may even be fast enough that you may get multiple calls within the same millisecond. So that also is a possibility, but we will see as soon as I go into browse mode that we will get some hits. So I'll go into browse mode. I will go back into layout mode now, and we can see that nothing really changed until I go back to my data viewer and I make one little change. I'm going to go over to my watch, and then I'm going to come back to my current. Now you can see that quite clearly hits was actually populated. Prior to going to watch and current, the only thing that hadn't happened was this had not been refreshed. And of course, FileMaker does have down at the bottom under, there is an option on the watch. There is a refresh values right here, but there is no refresh on the current variables in order to determine what's happening. So the magic reveal is this. We double click and we open up, and we can take a look and we can see how many times this was hit. And actually, here's a good representation. It was hit 2 times within the same millisecond of calling this. So we got it here, 2, 3. You can see the incrementing numbers quite clearly there. And if I selected all of those, what is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Whoosh. Think about it. That's 10 times of making the same execute SQL request in order to get a result to determine whether all of these things should be hidden or not based on whether the user is logged in. that is not going to be the most performant way to address this problem. So as we are assessing our performance, we use this type of tool in order to rethink what is the problem that I'm trying to solve. And in this scenario, when we think about it, the problem that's trying to be solved is we're simply trying to determine whether we should show all of these objects whether or not the user is logged in. So the question to me became, well, when I get to this particular layout, will I know whether or not the user is logged in? And you notice when we got the 10 objects, or the 10 hits that we had in the data viewer there. So out of all of these, there looks like there's more of them than we actually see in terms of the objects that we have on the layout. And that's actually true, because if we look at this and I drag this object off to the side, we can see that we have both a log in and a log out button. And yes, this one again had the same function. So I think I've belabored the point of how many times we are hitting that same execute SQL. What's the solution? Well, that's where we are going to go into our revised file and take a look at how I addressed this issue. And again, remember, if you're going to put in some type of metrics or some type of measuring, go ahead and take that out after you've revised the system. I don't want this to be part of the custom function, so I could leave it here and just comment this out. If I want to leave it there, I also have a shortcut key that I type in that will actually expand out this exact equation right here so that I can benchmark things really quickly. In this case, I've shown you how to do it. We will take this out and we'll say OK. So the solution in this problem scenario of making this a little bit more performant comes in like this. In file B here, I completely revised the dialog, and you can see when we look at this, the hide calculation is actually completely gone. I took it off of this whole scenario and simply determined once and for all, what am I going to show? Now, there's one thing I did. We can reveal our slide control. You can see that I took the opportunity where formerly only one slide control was being used and objects were being stacked on top of each other. In particular, it was the login button versus the log out button. I took the opportunity to make one panel for logging in and one panel for logging out. Knowing that I can selectively take the user to a given panel when I hit this layout. So I'm only going to have an either or situation. And you can see in the logged out, we simply have all of our different, when they are logged out, that means we're wanting to give them the opportunity to log in. And when they are logged in, we simply want to give them the opportunity to log out. So when we look at this one, we can say you're logged in as, here's your log out button. When you're not logged in, you get this one right here with the additional objects. But the key point here is we are only executing that execute SQL statement once. So we reduced it from the 10, 11, or 12 that we had, and we've reduced it down to 1 just by rethinking about how we could solve the problem. And when we go into this, you're going to see that what I had added was this right here. I added a script trigger on layout entry. So in other words, the really simple solution here was when I come to this layout, the user is either logged in or they aren't. And I'm going to give them one or the other. And I don't, on this layout, need to make that determination on each and every object each time that I bring the user to this particular layout. So that is the solution for this particular problem. We can actually take a look at it. We'll go to the layout setup here. If you haven't seen it, I made the determination right in the script trigger. I said, when the user enters the layout, we are going to determine whether they are logged in or not. If they are not logged in, of course, they go to this one. If they are logged in, then they get this one right here. And it's just a super simple equation that only runs it once, as I mentioned. And that is how we assess our performance in FileMaker. Simply remember, FileMaker is a ball of calculations. If your calculation is being applied to multiple things, where you could instead just apply that calculation to one instance and either use a container such as a slide panel or completely rethink the problem. Another solution to this could have been that I could have had two layouts. I could have had a login layout and a log out layout. And really the question always comes down to, what is my maintenance cost? How much will it cost me to maintain two layouts versus two panels on the same layout? And that is going to be subjective because you either are going to have the two things somewhere. In this case, the two things are within a slide panel. Otherwise, the two things would be two layouts. Or the two things would be two segments within a button bar instead of having two separate buttons. Code, in order to solve a problem, always has to exist, but how you implement is simply just a contrast against what you're going to have to do to maintain that code. So, as always, I hope this information has helped you out with regards to your own FileMaker solution, helped you determine how to assess your performance. I'd like to wish you much luck, and until next time, happy FileMaking.
We hope you've enjoyed this video tutorial, and we'd like to say thank you for your subscription and your support. If you're not already a subscriber, head on over to www.filemakermagazine.com/subscribe for more information about the benefits of joining.